Good morning, everybody. I'm Priyankar Kandarpa, and I'll be discussing the topic of empathy in the 21st century. But before I get into the topic, I wanted to tell you how I came up with the topic. Now, I hope none of the other speakers did this, but when the topic for the TEDx conference came up, Reviving Humanity, I Googled up cool humanity-related topics. Now, after a lot of searching and finding nothing, I came across the picture of the Afghan girl, the famous National Geographic picture of an Afghan refugee. Uh, but what I realized when I looked at that photo was I hadn't a trace of emotion. I seemed almost completely indifferent to the photo, in spite of the fact that it was reflective of massive human suffering of the refugees who were forced to flee during the Afghan war. It's at that stage that I realized maybe I know about this. I'm someone who watches the news every day, someone who tries my best to be aware of events around the world, but I don't think I have the capacity to empathize. And it's at that stage that I think that I came up with this topic, the distinction between sympathy and empathy, and the importance of empathy in our society today. I'm going to start with the boring definition part because I want to keep it brief. Empathy can be defined as trying to make yourself feel as someone else does. But it can actually be divided into two types of empathy. A psychology textbook would dictate that there is cognitive empathy and there is affective empathy. Affective empathy is when you mirror the face of someone who you view. That is, if you see someone who is distressed or disappointed, you too feel depressed or disappointed. But cognitive empathy is what I really think we need to be focusing on. Cognitive empathy is when you put yourself in someone's shoes, understand who that person is, try and understand the circumstances they are in, and therefore understand that person in their situation. And that's something that sounds very simple. We can all imagine ourselves in someone else's positions all the time, but it isn't. It's not very simple for us to put ourselves in someone else's shoes because we have our own way of thinking. So, has cognitive empathy really been around? I'd say cognitive empathy is something that's relatively rare. One person I sure found it in was George Orwell. In literature, we are discussing The Road to Wigan Pier, which is an excellent text which explores the conditions of suffering that the people of north of England had in the early 20th century. What I saw there was what one described as an empathy experiment. Rather than simply observing conditions, finding statistics, and putting them out there, what Orwell did was different. He tried to live as a person in society in the north of England, in similar conditions, in situations, as the people of the north of England. And keep in mind, Orwell is someone who came from a position of relative privilege. He was someone who was educated in some of the best schools in the United Kingdom. He was someone who was a colonial officer in Burma, someone who was, in other words, on his way to go to the civil service, someone of the traditional sort of a higher, upper middle class individual. So what Orwell did really struck me as an instance of someone who was truly trying to empathize, cognitive empathy. And the works he produced reflect this. They contain much more scope and depth, and indeed, you can actually feel what Orwell went through, and therefore what the people of the north of England went through in the early 20th century in miserable working conditions. And that's what really led to social change. It led to people changing their attitudes, changing the way they thought of how we should deal with grave injustices in the modern world. Indeed, we often think of empathy as something that's a flowery or cute emotion that a select few people have, but I would argue it really isn't. In fact, empathy can be revolutionary. It can lead to great social change. Once someone understands the predicament of another person, I think they understand circumstances. They understand why people make decisions they make. They understand what is needed to revive humanity, to create a more humane and just society. Now, stemming from what Orwell did, I'm going to try and explain to you why this cognitive empathy is so important in today's society. We often tend to live in a world where we are dominated by statistics. All of us read the news. All of us must be aware of grave injustices that happen around the world. But every single day, it's just another number, another figure that comes up in another poll or another news article. These many people are suffering from malnutrition around the world. These many icebergs have been, this mass of icebergs has been essentially melted, resulting in great and grave change to our climate. But what we don't understand is what those statistics mean. We tend to forget that behind the numbers, behind the information and the data, there are real human lives that are affected by a variety of events. Which is why we need to sort of broaden our scope and try and, rather than simply reading the headline, go beyond the headline and try and empathize with those in the situations that they are in. So that's why I think we need to take a much more revolutionary approach when it comes to empathy. Rather than simply empathizing with people, or at least pretending to empathize with people by discussing their predicament in a discussion, we should first try and see who we should empathize with. And no, by this I simply do not mean that we should be empathizing with a select few people, or people who you might traditionally think we should empathize with, those who suffer from prejudice, who of course deserve a great deal of our empathy, and there's a massive empathy deficit when it comes to them. But that's not all. I think we need to empathize with those in power. I think we need to empathize, because we need to understand how their decisions are being made, circumstances that people face in different situations. We need to empathize with those who make decisions that affect everybody, understand why they have made the decision they have. We need to empathize with people whose actions are regularly criticized by some sides, so that we could understand why they had to make a decision in the knowledge that it would have naturally resulted in enormous backlash. But of course, this brings me to the last part of my presentation, which is obviously going to be, in my view, the most important. And that is, why is it that we can't empathize with people? Why is it that in our society today, we don't really seem to care much about incidents, that we simply see a news article and scroll down to the next one? And I think it's because we've lacked experience. We do not understand what it means to be in another person's position. And I can hardly blame individuals for this. We need major institutional changes in order to establish a more empathetic civilization. For example, we need to change the way that education works. Consider the humanities, which is indeed, in recent years, has become one of the most neglected of topics. In history, for example, we shouldn't be simply learning dates or thinking it's this individual does that and that leads to this consequence. Instead, we should be trying to understand the human impact of each decision. We should be trying to delve deeper into how individuals themselves made decisions, and we need to continuously remind ourselves that education should also be to sort of one of the key aims of education should be that we should never be repeating the mistakes that we've made in the past. And indeed, in history, of course, it's one of the most important subjects for it. We shouldn't be simply blindly learning dates, or at least considering history as blindly learning dates and facts. Similarly, we shouldn't be considering economics as mugging up talking points from a textbook, or we shouldn't be considering literature mugging up quotes for an essay. We should be considering it as something that provides us a learning experience, allowing us to experience what someone else has experienced when we are in a position where we simply cannot do so. From the road to Wig and Peer in English literature to understanding development economics in our classes, I think it's this that would make real change in our world. We also need to change the way that we approach certain institutions. Now, I read a very interesting article by one of the big sociologists, Roman Krzyzarnik, who proposed that rather than simply erecting 1,000 new art museums, and of course we need to appreciate it, why don't we erect things like empathy museums, where we can, for example, see someone from a sweatshop in Vietnam and see how they do the work and do it ourselves, and then realize just how much they're paid for it. where we sort of figure out that the coffee that we drink isn't always so sweet, that the chocolate that we eat actually has a great deal of brutality behind its history and its production today. I think when we sort of get to individuals on that level, we can develop a more empathetic civilization. Now you might say, that's a lot of grand talk. That's a lot of grand solutions. Has it really actually occurred in the past? Of course it has. I don't want to get too much into history, but from what I recall, in the 1780s, there was slavery across the world. Slavery obviously was what oil is in the modern world. It was an imperative for the growth of Western economies in particular. But within about 37 years of 1780, slavery was essentially in decline, and within 47 years, the British Empire had banned slavery, 57, sorry. Why? Because rather than simply understanding what slavery is, the people of the United Kingdom were educated to do so. They were reading texts by people like Oleuda Equiano, a former slave who was freed after a series of very venturous tactics, and they understood what it meant, that the sugar that they put in their tea was not always so sweet. And I think that, more than anything else, was something that led to the great social movements in the United Kingdom that would first trigger the abolition of the slave trade in 1807 and then the abolition of slavery itself in 1837. And remember, it was no small feat. Slavery is something that had existed at that point in human society forever. There was never a society in the past, at least to my knowledge, that hadn't engaged in some form of slavery. And the abolition of it, therefore, was something that was a real game changer. It's something much bigger than, for instance, not using cars today. Hence, I would like to conclude my speech by highlighting that empathy is something that can deliver great change in our society. And I think that's what we need to be targeting. And if we don't, the consequences are grave. If we remain divorced from the true realities of our world today, we're never going to be able to find solutions to them. We will never quite understand what humanity is, let alone reviving humanity. And I think that once we develop a more empathetic civilization where we can understand how other people feel and the consequences of decisions that they make, rather than simply criticizing them or behaving as though we know everything, I think that's the time when we can really start making real progress to great social and political change and economic change. Thank you.